Welcome to Afrocentricity. I am your host, Michael Washington. Our topic is white privilege laws and white supremacy laws. This is part two of our panel discussion, which is moderated by Daniel Buford. Let's take a look.
Captain Lyles. Diana, I'm going to ask you the same question. Would you identify examples of white privilege laws and white supremacy laws that are found in the current or even past efforts by the Republican Party to suppress African American voting in the 2022 elections?
Thank you, Daniel. And I just want to say that anything that I've learned about race and racism and privilege has come from people of color, that there's no way I could have figured this out by myself. And so many of my mentors are in this room, and I have to recognize Dr. Michael Washington, Daniel Buford, excuse me, and David Billings as teaching me so much about the history of this country. Allergies, so sorry. White supremacy is the basic foundation and building blocks of this nation. It was started out of an idea of white supremacy. It was started because this nation was supposed to be white and continues to be white. But if you don't understand race and racism, you're not going to understand, excuse me, you're not going to understand how this has unfolded and how it has benefited every white person that ever became white in this nation. It's a foundation that I think is pretty masterful and pretty brilliant in creating a smokescreen to hide the original intentions of what we were doing with this white supremacy foundation from people who would become white. And that is the point of it, is to keep us in the dark. Those of us are white in the dark, so that we don't fight against things that are harming not only people of color, but harming everybody in this country by the outcomes of our institutions. We are a nation of people that is not only ahistoric, but we are also anti-historic people, which is important in keeping the illusion alive that all people are created equal and we all have an equal chance in this country. If we knew the truth, there might be some changes coming in this country. Every law that is passed, David, I agree with every single thing you said, and I was going to say a lot of it because I learned it from you, so you threw me off a little bit there, but thank you, David. Every law can become a white supremacy law, no matter what it's cloaked in, and we cloak it in ways that people don't recognize how it can become white supremacy law. Ariel Allen of NYU said, the nostalgia of ignorance. We are living in a country that does not understand history, and there's great nostalgia and peace in not understanding and becoming ignorant of everything. I think this one statement that Joe Barnes said, Reverend Joe Barnes said, says it all. Every system and institution in the United States was originally created and structured legally and intentionally to serve white people exclusively. Every institution was set up that way. And it has been upheld by every law in the Supreme Court in this country. But to understand that, we have to understand, how did they control white people to fight for a system that actually harms us too? We had to develop something called race. And the development of race then also puts the screen over our eyes so we can't see what's happening. Race was created to make sure that whites would always come out on top and give us a way to hold our power and privilege in place by creating subclasses of human beings, so that white people begin to understand that they are better than others, and you're looking down at who's under you and you're not looking up at who's controlling you. and creating a system that harms us all. Dr. Michael Washington, can I quote you on what is race? I mean, because this is one of the most do I get an amen or a yes?
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Go on,
Okay.
go on, sister.
And I think this is besides the statement by Joe Barn, how every institution was created legally and intentionally to support white people only. Race is, when we understand what race is, we'll understand how we as white people have been able to carry this out. Dr. Washington says race is a specious classification of humans created by Europeans or white to, number one, to assign human worth and social status, using himself or white as a model of humanity and the height of human achievement for the purposes of establishing and maintaining privilege and power for those who would become white. So you put this thing called race, you define race. I mean, race in itself has no essence, but it is the greatest effector of your outcomes in life in the United States, and yet has no essence in biology or those kinds of ways. If you go back and you look at the writings of early writers in this country and see what their vision was for the United States, don't read the Constitution. Read what they're saying and what they want this country to become. So Thomas Jefferson wrote, Providence has been pleased to give this one people, connected to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in manners and customs. Jefferson looked forward to a time when this continent was covered with this kind of people. So how do you create the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast? You use poor white people as the colonizers, those of us to steal the land from the natives and from Mexicans and move us across and seed us in the country so it then could become a one United States. So in 1804, we had the Louisiana Purchase. 1848, we got the land from France, not from natives, from France. So hear me loud and clear. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we got 50% of the land of Mexico. In 1896, the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act gave away 246 million acres of land. And all you had to do was go settle on it, be able to live there successfully for 5 years, build a 12 by 15 structure, and be a white person in good standing. And you could get that land. So we're doling the land out to white people. We're making sure that only citizens could own land. And we make sure from 1790 that we said that only white people could become citizens of this country. So by the end of the 1800s, 3/4 of white people own land. This is white supremacy in its fullest, right? 3/4 of white people own land by the end of 1800. And today, 46 million people, white people, benefit from this. We create laws that benefit white people and have throughout the history of this country. And if they don't work to our benefit as white people, we change them. And we've seen that happen over and over again. I'm gonna read you one more quote. Reginald Horseman was born in England in 1930, but he talks about how this country, Manifest Destiny, how this country was set up. And he says, in the middle of the 19th century, a sense of racial destiny permeated the discussion of American progress and future American world destiny. By 1850, the emphasis was on the American Anglo-Saxon as a separate, innately superior people who were destined to bring good government, commercial prosperity, and Christianity to the American continent and to the world. This was a superior race, and inferior races were doomed to subordination, subordinate status, or extinction. This is our history. This is what got us to where we are today. And one of the greatest white supremacy legislation is the fact that we cannot teach this history. It's unfair to everybody in this country, and it's particularly unfair to those of us. Building the United States is, Dr. Muka Jose told me this, building the United States is like thinking about playing the game of Monopoly. And what you do when you play Monopoly is you buy land, and then you gain your wealth and you get more and more wealthy. So we as white people have been on this land for over 400 years. And then we tell people of color, well, you can come on now, 60 years ago, and expect the outcomes to be the same when the laws don't change, but they continue to benefit white people. I'll say one more time. Every time there has been a chance in the history of this country where people of color might or blacks might have the ability to get some of the rights that they are due, what do? We have a back cry by white people to say, what about me? So after when the enslavement of Africans was ended, the back cry from white people was free the whites. So we can't be free if all of them got free, right? So free the whites, get the attention on me. There's a chance I might not get all of my rights that I've had throughout the history of this country. So free the whites. After the civil rights movement, when affirmative action came into being, which is quite interesting, that was affirmative action for people of color, because white people have had affirmative action since the first time we stepped foot on this land. We've been affirmed in the action. But the back cry from the civil rights movement was just slipped out of my mind. Reverse discrimination. I'm sorry. I am 75, Reginald. That's why I can't remember words all the time. Reverse discrimination. It's about me, man. If you give them rights, I'm not going to have as many rights. These are the cries we have. What was the cry after Obama, the first black man gets elected to the president of this country? What was the cries that we heard? Most people will say, make America great. That was one of the cries, but there was a much more significant cry. And that cry was, take back our country. Take back our country. This is supposed to be ours. And the laws have backed us up. The Constitution has backed us up. The Supreme Court has backed us up. Every outcome of every institution has backed us up. And that's what we have to be paying attention to. So we as white people have to wake up, study the history, and begin to see how we, even us WMWFs, us well-meaning white folks, are holding this system in place because we don't understand how it was put into place. So that's what my cry is: wake up, America, and wake up, white people, because you actually, it's more dangerous being around liberal white people, because you never know which way they're going to fall, than it is being around that bigoted people that entered the White House on January 6th, because you know what they're going to do. You don't know what we're going to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana Dunn. Wow. Okay, well, you just made me want to interject something before Dr. Mike talks. And you remind me of two things. You remind me of something that Dick Gregory said about white liberals. That is, that Dick Gregory said that the white liberal is the white person that will hang you from the lowest limb on the tree. So that's what the great Dick Gregory said. But also when we look at these ideas, we must understand that there's a certain privilege and bias that is already built in. So Reverend Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, speaking of the Republicans and the Democrats, who today the Democrats are allegedly our friends, but remember that the Republicans are the party of Lincoln. So with this kind of duplicity and fork-tongued aspect of both parties operating at all times that we've been in this country, he said that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are two wings of the same buzzard. So on that note, I will ask Dr. Michael Washington to answer that question, would you identify examples of white privilege and white supremacy laws found in the current efforts by the Republican Party to suppress African American voting in the 2022 elections?
What comes to my mind when I think of white privilege slash supremacy laws is how basketball star LeBron James's voting rights group relates to the states that I work and live in, which are Kentucky and Ohio, respectively. From my perspective, LeBron is modeling the behavior required to prevent black votes from being suppressed. For instance, when he launched his More Than a Vote group in the wake of the George Floyd murder, he organized members of his community to take a stand against injustice. Some of the members of his celebrity community of black athletes, entertainers, and others, including football quarterback Patrick Mahomes, basketball star Jalen Rose, and actor Kevin Hart, etc. The group mobilizes voters to address criminal justice reform as well as voter suppression, and he is not shy when it comes to defending the group's activism. In fact, he has been proud to tell the media that he will use his celebrity status as a platform to shed light on the injustice of racism. An example of that is when he called for the arrest of the cops who fired the fatal bullets that killed Breonna Taylor. He informed her family and the Commonwealth of Kentucky of his expectation of justice. When he found out about the voter suppression taking place in the two most populous and diverse cities in Kentucky, Lexington and Louisville, he fired up the issue on Twitter, which exposed to the world that each of the cities had only one in-person polling site. His celebrity star power could have been used in Kentucky over the past decades as Kentucky created one of the worst and most restrictive voting systems in the country. In 2016, before the pandemic, the Election Performance Index ranked Kentucky 44th out of 50 states, mostly because Kentucky had no early voting and had stringent requirements to request an absentee ballot. Thanks to the decision made by county clerks in Lexington and Louisville to staff only one polling place for Election Day during the pandemic, was national attention brought to the issue of voter suppression in Kentucky. The attention has resulted in comprehensive plans put in place, which include making absentee ballots available for all voters, providing early in-person voting options for 15 days leading up to the election day, and establishing a polling place for election day in-person voting. Other organizations joined up with James's group to focus on the issue of voter suppression in Georgia, where measures included limiting the use of drop boxes to return ballots, requiring photo identification for voting by mail, and cutting back early voting on weekends. With the support of many organizations like LeBron's group called More Than a Vote, the determined voters of Georgia did their part in winning 2 congressional seats and the office of the presidency for the Democrats. This is precisely the type of effective organizing and mobilizing that must take place within the state of Ohio and several other states if the voters hope to prevent public education from becoming an agent that socializes future voters to be victims of white supremacy laws that condition people to accept as normal behavior the devaluation of cultures of people of color. Voters must be aware of the power of their vigilance and voting strength. They must use this power to reject white privilege laws that propose to use the curriculum of public education to indoctrinate students with detrimental white biases about the history of the United States, such as teaching students that no racism was involved systematically when the Founding Fathers used the Constitution to deny the, quote, Indians not taxed and 3/5 of all other persons, end of quote, which was a racist way of saying enslaved Africans. Racist because the white founders did not recognize the people from Africa as being fully human. This means that voters must make themselves aware of the movement that opposes critical race theory. A growing number of Ohio's Republican lawmakers want to put a stop to a new way some schools are teaching history called critical race theory, which is an academic concept based on the idea that racism is more than individual bias, but rather a systemic phenomenon that is embedded into our legal system, our algorithms, and our laws. Supporters say that critical race theory teaches how racism shaped public policy and life in the United States, while opponents, like the sponsors of House Bill 322, call it a dangerous and divisive theory designed to look at everything from a race-first lens, which they say is the very definition of racism. When Republican Don Jones, a representative from Freeport, announced the bill, he said it was an anti-American doctrine that has no place in Ohio's schools because students should not be asked to, quote, examine their whiteness, end of quote. If passed, House Bill 322 would prohibit schools from requiring teachers to use examples from current events or ongoing controversial issues in their classrooms. And schools couldn't require lessons about current pieces of legislation or groups lobbying for or against them. The bill bans the State Board of Education, school boards, and school districts from requiring teachers and staff members to adopt certain beliefs, including, quote, the advent of slavery in the territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding of the United States, end of quote. In other words, when discussing the colonial economies, teachers will not be required to teach their students that the founding of the United States could not have occurred without the production of tobacco, which necessitated slave labor. That's why George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe were all slaveholders from Virginia. Neither will teachers be required to inform their students that during the colonial period, the wealth created throughout the entire Western world depended on the capture of and trade in Africans who were in bondage. The absence of this knowledge prevents students from knowing the difference between immigration from European countries and forced immigration from Africa, or the African slave trade, as they called it. Another belief that teachers will not be required to teach is that, quote, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from true American values like liberty and equality, end of quote. In other words, teachers are not required to teach students that slavery was a major issue that led to the Civil War, or that legitimate colonial, state, and federal governments controlled by whites imposed racism on the Native Americans, the Mexican populations, by white explorers, pioneers, and settlers who manifested their destiny by seizing the continent from sea to shining sea. The passage of House Bill 322 would also compel teachers to teach their students that the legal system known as Jim Crow segregation was a mere deviation from true American values like liberty and equality. States like Idaho, Tennessee, Rhode Island, and Texas have all introduced bills to ban the teaching of critical race theory in the public schools. In Texas, Republican State Representative Steve Toth is the primary author of state's House Bill 3979, which seeks to ban critical race theory. Toth believes that a curriculum that teaches young people about systemic racism is itself a form of racism, and that both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Martin Luther King endorse this issue, which supports laws that permit the whitewashing of history at the expense of the rights of non-citizens. This is what comes to mind when I think of these laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. I was really taken by your comment about that they're equating critical race theory with something that is outside of what U.S. history is all about, and having a limited view of what racism is with respect to only being personal attitude, volition, and behavior, when in fact the third treaty, which is the Covenant to End Racial Discrimination that the United States Senate ratified, it expressly acknowledges and condemns racial discrimination and obliges parties to pursue by all appropriate means and without delay a policy of elimination of racial discrimination in all its forms. And those forms include the institutional and structural manifestations of it. Earlier, when we were signing in to this Zoom call, as far as I know, we only had one of our scheduled respondents on the line, and that is Dr. Ron Glass. I wanted to know if Kelly Germain or Juan Gomez or Ken Tankersley have joined by now.
Kelly has.
Kelly has?
I'm here.
Okay.
It looks like we're both here.
I'm here.
Oh, okay, well, Ron, we're going to go with you, and then we'll go with Kelly. But
Ken.
let me, Ken's on also? Okay, good. Well, I'm going to introduce Ron, then Kelly, then Ken. Okay, Ron Glass, in addition to being a good friend for many years, is a PhD and professor of philosophy of education at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is the PhD program director in the education department at UC Santa Cruz, and he is the president of the Philosophy of Education Society. He has many different interviews and accolades to his credit, and one of those things has to do with things that you can find on Pacifica Radio Network, where he is reflecting on revolutionary education and Paul Freire's life and ideas. Ron, I met Paulo Freire through Ron, and he is now acknowledged as a leading authority on what Paulo Freire meant when he was talking about pedagogy of the oppressed, so much so that the newest edition of Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, includes extensive commentary by Dr. Ron Glass, who currently resides in Berkeley, California. Also responding is Kelly Germain, Ms. Kelly Germain, who is a trauma-informed racial equity trainer, an institutional change strategist and researcher, and also a community organizer. She resides in North Carolina. And then the last respondent is Dr. Ken Tankersley, who is an enrolled member of the Pequot Shawnee. He is an archaeologist teaching at the University of Cincinnati. His work has been featured on the National Geographic Channel, the Animal Planet, the History Channel, BBC, Nature, Wall Street Journal, and on All Things Considered. He is the author of numerous articles and the book entitled Dr. Charles Lewis Metz and the American Indian Archaeology of Little Miami River Valley. Dr. Tankersley lives in Kentucky. So, Ron, what are your impressions and reflections on what you've heard?
Well, first, I have to say thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation this morning, and I'll try to be brief in my comments. I speak to you from my home in Berkeley, California, which is on Ohlone lands, the Muwekma Chechnya bands of the Ohlone tribe. And the struggle continues here over there. They're trying to preserve their local sacred shell mound from development. And Dan knows a lot about that struggle from his own participation in it. But I grew up a settler in the southern reaches of the Algonquin-speaking peoples in the land of the Shawanokie or the Shawnee. And I actually went to Shawnee school from second grade through my high school graduation. And my ancestors arrived in those lands really in desperation and hope. They were running away from pogroms in one case, or imprisonment in another case, or orphanhood in another case. And that sort of uprooted tumbleweed family got intertwined with the Lenni Lenape, the traditional grandparents to the Shawanokie, who themselves had been driven from the East Coast to the Ohio River Valley lands by the colonial violence that they were experiencing. So all of this violence led to my own tangled settler roots, which grabbed hold in that land that had already been cleared of the Shawanokie, right? The Shawnee and the Lenape alike, everyone was gone, pushed east to the east, pushed west beyond the Mississippi. And so my roots come up out of that slate clay of left behind by the glacial scrape of Ohio, right? That's the clay of which I am. I'm a person from that valley, and it's a great honor to be with you today. So thank you very much for the invitation, and to Dan and to Mike for organizing us. My comments in listening to all this, is white supremacy, of course, is responding now like the cornered rats they are, right? With increasing violence. It's a desperate move, the effort to shut all this down. They understand that they are a people of the past, right? And I really am pleased. I spend a lot of time, I have the privilege as an elder still spending a lot of time with young people. And I see the resistance culture really on the rise. It's Black Lives Matter crossed race lines, it crossed class lines, it went global, where there's an energy that is afoot. And I feel that. There's another energy among white people that was launched by Occupy around debt. And out of the global South, women of color are leading a global campaign around debt, right? And understanding the way in which debt and bondage replaced slavery, right? That slavery depended on a kind of indebtedness. And if you weren't a slave, you were an indentured servant of one sort or another. There were many forms of slavery, right? And there still are. And it comes through debt and the prison system. And so those are held in place, as we've heard, by police and state violence, by our housing codes, by our miseducation that produces all this violence. Because the violence isn't just at the spectacular level of police killings or the hangings, as it's always been, right? The violence is also really intimate, deep into our lives, into our dreams, into the intimacy of our sex lives, of our desires, of our fantasies, right? So this work is deep. And the debt and the bondage that we have been enslaved to through capitalism and through all of these systems and structures leaves not us owing a debt, but the debt is to us. It's reparations, it's abolition. It's time to abolish these systems. We'll never end the supremacists, the white supremacists, but we can end white supremacy. And I look to the new generations who are trying to seize this moment, and we elders have to share our wisdom, share our pain, share our suffering over these years. How many killings do we have to witness? Whoever thought we'd see it on TV, on instant replay, right? Whoever thought that? Who thought we could be tortured in those ways, right? But we have freedom dreams. The new generation speaks their freedom dreams, and we have to listen to that. We have to respond to this spectacular violence with spectacular nonviolence. We have to stand strong against every form of violence, whether it is the huge public displays, whether it's the murders, whether it's the school to prison pipeline. And we have to stand against the intimate violence in our home life and among genders. We have to stand against all of that. And when we can really build a movement that unearths seeds of fire, to Paul Forth Highlander, my mentor, Miles Horton, not just my mentor, Paulo Freire, right? And we have to remember that race is a consequence of racism. Race is a consequence of racism, and join the struggle that crosses generations, crosses so-called races, crosses so-called genders, crosses so-called classes, and understands that we are all human beings, each and every one of us. And each and every one of us has the power to make a difference in our everyday lives and in the systems that touch us and that we touch. So seize the moment and stand with the young folk. That's what I hear.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ron, and that's what I feel from you. And it's a very heartfelt statement. I'm feeling that too. Next, Kelly, could you give your response and your impressions of the things that were said earlier in response to the question that I had posed?
Sure. Thank you so much, Reverend Buford, and thank you for having me, everyone. Similar to Diana Dunn, I'm a white woman who learned everything I know about racism from people of color and other white anti-racist elders. And I'm coming to this call from some meetings with the Anglican Church in Canada. So I grew up in Ohio, and then I grew up back and forth in Canada, which is where my dad's from. And I really grew up believing that racism was a Southern thing and not something that happened on the West Coast or in the North, or especially not in Canada. And the more that we're uncovering the history in Canada, it's very identical to the history of the United States, in the ways that some of you have already noted, that the origins of white supremacy and voting discrimination are embedded in our foundations. So I appreciate all of the foundational conversations that have happened so far. The group that we've been working with today just realized in examining their institution after they, I'm sure many are aware that last couple of weeks they uncovered 215 buried Indigenous children from the genocide of the residential schools in Canada. And the churches up there are starting to reckon with their complicity in that. And folks in the room today started to reckon with the fact that my job is to uphold the rules of this system, and yet the rules of this system continue to perpetuate racism, even when they're not explicitly racist. And so I'm just hearing that a lot in our discussion today on voting rights as well, and how that's playing out in the States. My experience with starting to understand modern forms of racism and how it relates to voting was first through my experience with the prisons down here in North Carolina. My husband was placed as a chaplain in some of the prison system down here. And that's when we, as white people, first got awakened to the fact that there were whole communities of people of color, particularly Black folks, who had been taken from their community and incarcerated under what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, and that was intentionally designed to shapeshift racism in a way that would rob particularly Black men of their ability to vote, and that the implications of being incarcerated under a felony are strategically designed to strip Black people, particularly, of their right to vote. And so that really awakened me to how racism just continues to shapeshift and find ways to make it so that Black people cannot vote. I also, when organizing in Cincinnati, had some conversations with Indigenous folks there through the American Indian movement around how the Electoral College is specifically designed to suppress the Indigenous vote as well. And so I'm sitting with all of these learnings that we've been having. Another learning that I'm concerned about with my generation that came out of organizing around the 2016 election in Cincinnati, Ohio, was even within our movements, particularly younger folks like myself, there started to become this narrative that because, like we've said earlier, that the Democrats really aren't any better than the Republicans in their enacting of white supremacy, that there's almost this false dichotomy of that means we shouldn't vote, or that voting wouldn't help change anything or be a measure of protection. And so what I continued to see in organizing locally in Cincinnati, particularly as Me Too got kind of co-opted by primarily white women and started to focus almost exclusively on electoral politics to the exclusion of other things, that there just became a big movement of people across race in Cincinnati who normally would have voted but said, I'm not going to vote because it's not a radical thing to vote, that voting doesn't change anything. And so it was really, I'm still sitting with that learning, because that learning just feels like, wow, we organized so hard for, numbers of years to get access to voting, but then this narrative is swirling in our community that voting is not a radical act. And so I'm sitting with how to build culture around understanding the both and of doing more than electoral politics and also engaging in electoral politics. I'm also sitting with the fact that our church in Cincinnati, alongside Dr. Washington and Reverend Billings, visited us there too. And after doing a lot of this history lesson in our church, almost every single wealthy white person in our church, after sitting with this history, went on to vote for Trump under the justification that it was in their financial interest. Most of them now see that actually Trump never followed through on any of the tax breaks that he had promised them. But I'm continuing to sit with that lesson on how to move white people with this history in a way that will shift our behavior and response to the call for solidarity. So thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, and thank you for your voice. I think you have less gray hair than anybody else on this whole panel, so you're holding it. You're holding it down for the generation that you're representing. So I'm really glad that you could be a part of this conversation. We're going, just for everybody's information, because we did get started a little bit late and we've had a few technical glitches. We're going to go another maybe 10 minutes or so. Excuse me?
Just keep going.
Okay, Dr. Mike said we can keep on going for the next 3 or 4 hours, so we're not going to take that much time, but we will take a little bit more time so that people will get a chance to respond again. I'd like to ask Dr. Kenneth Tankersley, who I met last year during the midst of the COVID quarantine time, and we actually had a great meeting. I think we met the first time and talked for about 2 hours over coffee and donuts and everything else, and maybe got on the nerves of the people at the restaurant, but we just kept on talking. So, Dr. Tankersley, let me say that Dr. Ken Tankersley, he's really good with looking at rocks on the ground and figuring out what's a bone and what's pottery and what's flint. And he took Dr. Washington and I to some spots in Madisonville. I call it Madisonville because it's now Mariemont, but he took us to some places and really showed us some things about how Shawnee people not only live, but how their burial sites are being desecrated the same way that the Ohlone people's desecration of burial sites is being organized against. So, Dr. Tankersley, I don't know how much of this conversation you've been able to tune into, but if you could talk a little bit about this from your perspective as being part of the Shawnee Pequot Nation, and how these white supremacy laws have affected some of the things that you've been seeing as you travel around Indian country.
Thanks, Dan. Actually, I've been with you the whole time. So,
oh, great.
Dan forgot to mention we were in school together back in 1960, but that's another conversation.
Well, that's many moons ago. We go to Madisonville Elementary School together and didn't even know each other.
That's right. So, Oshio Oginali, Sha Aniyuya, Sha Pikwa Shawano, Sha Anidika Sha, Sha Mishinikinakwa. I'd like to remind you that what I just said prior to 1978 would have been a felony. It was illegal for Native people to speak their own language. I would argue that the laws do not support underrepresented minorities, anyone. In fact, they work against us. The GOP is currently using the laws against us, the laws that are there to protect us. To give you some idea of the legacy of white supremacy, not only with the GOP, and remember that back in Abraham Lincoln's day, they had the stance of the Democrats today. At some point during the last century, the Republicans took the Democratic stance and the Democrats took the Republican stance, this shift over who to support, business or the people. The legacy of suppressing underrepresented minority votes goes back to the passage of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was passed in 1970. It granted all United States citizens the right to vote regardless of race. However, the conservatives of the time used that by saying, well, it depends who is a person. In 1870, Native Americans were not persons. It wasn't until 9 years later when a Ponca named Standing Bear in U.S. District Court argued successfully that he was a person. But even though arguing that Native Americans were persons and getting the U.S. District Court to agree that Native Americans were persons, it wasn't until the Snyder's Act of 1924 that Native Americans had the right to vote. Well, why then did we have to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965? The Voting Rights Act essentially helped secure and protect the right for all underrepresented minorities, Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, everyone, the right to vote. What most people don't realize is the conservatives recently went to the Supreme Court and invalidated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Consequently, without Section 5, it's a meaningless law. And the GOP has used it, especially in the states of Alaska, Arizona, and South Dakota, where there are large Native American populations, and Montana including, to suppress Native American votes. It's been used, as we've been discussing this afternoon, to suppress African American votes across the country. Between 2018 and 2019, Congress introduced the Native American voting rights to increase Native American access and voter registration in polling locations and allow tribal ID cards to be used for identification processes. Keep in mind that Native Americans are the only US citizens which I have to carry a card that identifies who I am, and I am legally a Native American. You have to be a member, as was mentioned earlier, about the Ohlone in San Francisco, who are state recognized tribe and federally recognized tribes. We have to carry cards. Basically, what the Republicans, the GOP, is using is essentially outlawing their new proposed legislation outlaws non-traditional addresses. That eliminates a large segment of underrepresented minorities, reducing voter registration. What happens if you don't have a computer to register online? Again, voter ID, having a specific type of voter identification, denying access to in-person polling places, and then, of course, denying voter by mail. Keep in mind that the vast majority of Native Americans vote, and we're talking over 5 million people, over 5 million Native Americans who voted by mail in the past election. I would argue that the GOP legislation suppressing the right to vote undermines our most basic right to participate in our democracy. The loss of our right to vote is the loss of a voice in the democratic process. Thank you.
Go a little bit longer than the 1:30 time, because this is getting deep and is getting juicy here. I wanted to revisit some things that were said earlier by Dr. Washington and by Kelly Germain, that using that word again, are germane to the next set of questions that I want to pose. But before I pose those questions, I just wanted to talk about the second part of our talk today. Refers to a word that Kelly had used when she was talking about false dichotomies. And I want to lift up the name of one of my mentors, Dr. Edwin Nichols, formerly of the National Institute of Mental Health, who I first met in Cincinnati, speaking at the University of Cincinnati, where he gave one of the most brilliant speeches I ever heard, delivered within 20 minutes before lunchtime, called The Philosophical Aspects of Cultural Differences. And at one point in that talk, he introduced to the people and to me the concept of dichotomous logic, which is the either-or line of reasoning based on opposites and polarities, falsely designed opposites and polarities. And without getting as deep as Dr. Nichols could get, or that I even could get, which wouldn't be as deep as him on this, I would just say that dichotomous logic is the logic of the forked tongue. It's the logic of the liar that you hear in Congress and Senate as they create false dichotomies and false equivalencies, using dichotomous logic as the basis for those things. Now, some of us are not familiar with the concept of dichotomous logic, which is a logical fallacy, but we are also familiar with some of the aspects of it that have come out in social policy and legislation. That is to say that Jim Crow, segregation, apartheid, the logic of those ill-conceived social programs and policies and legislations, all of them are based on the either-or line of reasoning that Dr. Nichols talked to us about. So I just wanted to revisit that concept that Kelly had talked about when she spoke of false dichotomies. Dr. Washington talked about false equivalencies. And false equivalencies, just to use a colloquial way of putting it, this is like comparing apples to oranges. And equivalence is drawn between two subjects based on flawed or false reasoning. It's a fallacy of inconsistency, actually, in logic. It is an argument or claim in which two completely opposing arguments appear to be logically equivalent when they are not. A couple of people on this conversation, Reggie Lyles talked about the January 6, 2020 insurrection, as a couple of other people have mentioned. Now here you have an actual insurrection where at least seven people were dead, 5 of them police, some of them permanently disabled both physically and psychologically. This was an armed attack during an official proceeding of the U.S. Congress. And it was incited and encouraged and promoted and directed by former President Donald Trump. They were trying to interrupt the certification of the recent presidential election. Now, this insurrection, which was indeed an insurrection, called for the lynching and hanging of the the Vice President Michael Pence. But that effort has been equated, now this is where we talk about false equivalence, that effort has been equated with peaceful Black Lives Matters protests. And even the Black Lives Matters protests that were infiltrated by elements of the police posing as Antifa have also been equated with that, so much so that Kevin McCarthy wanted to mix Black Lives Matters protests into the whole area of the investigation of the insurrection that happened earlier this year. And there's never been any Black Lives Matters protest, even the ones that were infiltrated by the police and Antifa, that even approached being an insurrection that had deaths of police and the maiming of police and the other things that have happened. Here's some other examples of false equivalencies that come from out of that. The death of the female insurrectionist who was shot while sticking her head through a broken window, that's been equated with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. The illegal insurrection and attempted overthrow of the U.S. government was equated with the civil rights movement demonstrations of the 1960s, which were all nonviolent. It's even been called a Rosa Parks moment. We know of Kevin McCarthy and the others who have been a part of that, but also the Fox News Channel and OAN have been propagating this as propaganda that those who benefit from white privilege and white supremacy are supported by. KQED on June 13th, 2019, came out with a editorial and article and news report that has its title, False Equivalency, Why It's So Dangerous. That's on the program Above the Noise. Chris Hayes on MSNBC on April 22nd, 2021, he took issue with the moral equivalence being made between the Black Lives Matters movement and the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. So moral equivalence is also a type of a false equivalence. So then we want to just go quickly round robin, first going back to the top of the panel again, David, then Captain Reginald Lyles, Diana, Michael, etc. So if you could all just opine on that idea of false equivalence and false moral equivalence that you've heard both by news media personnel as well as elected officials. David?
what came to my mind, Reverend Dan, was immediately how uh, Black Lives Matter was trivialized by saying, first, well, don't all lives matter, as if this had always been on the top of the agenda in the United States. But then it was trivialized by making it a commercial phrase, uh, Verizon matters, and pretty soon it had been so, the passion behind and the justice behind uh, Black Lives Matter, which was tied to the continued killings of Black people by police, was, caught in quicksand of publicized language. The other thing that someone, I think Diana Dunn mentioned earlier, is, that racism uh, being immediately said, well, there's reverse racism too. First, kind of spontaneous reactions anytime racism is mentioned. And finally, just to reiterate how um, the storming of the U.S. Capitol by white supremacists, a white riot, but the term race riot, which is overwhelmingly exampled through history as being white people rioting when we feel our threats, our privileges are somehow at risk. But in the public mindset has been made synonymous with Black people's resistance um, to white violence. So, we quickly, and I owe uh, Dan Buford much in understanding, my understanding, limited as it is, of the linguistics of racism, how intentional certain words and phrases were used to dehumanize and make trivialized the lives of people of color. And I'll just leave it at that so that others might speak.
Okay, Captain Lyles. We can't hear you, Reggie.
What came to mind, Dan, to me when you were talking, was the Million Man March
Okay.
that I participated in Washington D.C., led by, Muslims um, um, who came into D.C. Million African American men from all over. Not one incident. Not one incident. But prior to it, they said, oh, it's going to be terrible. And there were military tanks and everything all up and down the city, guards posted everywhere. And then in this particular event on January 6th, you could not find any military. You could not find any equipment. That to me is how to do that. Somebody had to plan that and work very hard at saying, look, they're not going to tear your property up. Your property is going to be protected. They're going to be confined into a certain area. You have to make agreements with people to do that. So this thing goes very, very deep in the lying, in the planning, and the conspiracy of January the 6th. It could not be done without major people in the military and in the police department, in the CIA and the FBI going along with it. It could not be. I'm just concerned. How did they convince the businessmen to allow this to happen without, risking their property from being destroyed? That you have to sit down with people to make them feel assured what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. So, and then the lie saying that Black Lives Matter people were the ones who did the destruction in January 6th. There were Black Lives Matter people doing that. No way. You couldn't get a reasonable thinking black man to be in that crowd. We know what that crowd is about. I mean, but they say this kind of foolishness, and I don't believe that white America believes them. I just think white America believes that we can lie when we want to. I don't think white America is dumb, or I don't care if you college educated or postgraduate degree or no degree. I don't buy that white America's, oh, we're naive. Oh, I didn't believe this is happening. You know, it is critically important that they want to believe the lie. We can lie when we want to, and we can make reality what it is no matter what happens.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
All right. Diana, what you got to say about that?
Just, well, I probably could think of so many, but we have been pushing undoing racism, and undoing racism is about changing the systems. It's about shifting power in this country. So what has overlaid that and pushed that to the side is the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion industry that comes in and now is an $8 billion business done by corporations, the ones that are creating the racial disparities and outcomes. They've turned it over to them. And what they're doing is trying to change the people coming in and not changing the systems and the culture of the systems, and not undoing racism, but and not shifting power. So I would see that as people equating it to a moral equivalency, but it's also much easier to do DEI. And you can also, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. I actually think that, you know, first you have to have diversity, then inclusion, and then you might get equity, but they don't put it in the order that it goes, because if you put it in that order, it would say die. And that's what we're going to do if we keep going after diversity, equity, and inclusion without addressing racism. So that's my first one. And the second one is we have been trying to prove to the world that racism is not about individual acts of oppression and violence and et cetera, but the Department of Justice and many other people in this country keep pointing to the extreme white supremacists. So as long as we keep the extreme white supremacists on view, then those of us that are white don't have to think of us as being racist, because you're focusing the country's attention. You're defining race and racism about the extremists, not about us as white people. So I think that's definitely a diversionary tactic, and also a linguistic tactic, by the way, Daniel Buford. And the last I'll say is that we have moved as a country from movement building and community solutions to individual solutions. And when we get into individual solutions, we create programs, and those programs point the finger at the people that are being oppressed by this country, and not using systemic solutions to the problems by changing the institutions. Does that make sense? I said it really, really fast.
Yeah, well,
but I think that's the biggest one, going from individual solutions to problems that are societal problems. And to continue to allow this country to I can have the highest degree in my field, I can be in the highest degree of authority, and I can have racial disparities coming out of my institutions, and I will never be judged or evaluated by that.
All right, thank you.
So those are the dichotomies that I was, not dichotomies, but the false equivalencies.
Thank you for that, Diana. Dr. Michael Washington, I'm going to ask you to reiterate that save the date item at this point.
Before you, item?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were in the process also of planning a sequel to this particular forum, and we want you to think in terms of early August. Sometime in early August, we'll be coming back with another sequel with a little bit more development of the things that I'll be saying right now regarding the dichotomous aspect of this. And I just got 3 really quick points. If passed, House Bill 322 would prohibit schools from requiring teachers to use examples from current events or ongoing controversial issues in their classrooms. This bill implies that for the state government to not require teachers to teach current events or ongoing controversial issues is equivalent to good educational pedagogy. Now, if pedagogy can be defined as the art, science, or profession of teaching, then good teaching is to encourage students to engage in learning about current events in ways that foster the development of critical thinking skills. Good pedagogy would result in students having the skills to understand the news, to articulate the differences in coverage between Fox News and CNN Newsroom on controversial social issues. For the government to encourage students to avoid current events may create students who are vulnerable to the type of stereotypic propaganda that justifies police killings of people of color, so that the avoidance of current events by teachers is a false equivalent to effective educational pedagogy. Number 2, another false equivalent is the argument that teaching about racism is equivalent to practicing racism. For this to be an accurate equivalency would mean that when a teacher teaches students that the U.S. Constitution disqualified Native Americans and enslaved African Americans from being citizens in Article 1, Section 2, that the teacher's actions caused equal harm to the students as the harm caused by the founding fathers to the Native and African Americans who were denied citizenship. This argument is as ludicrous as a representative of white supremacy laws using the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to justify the insidious imposition of white biases into the public education curriculum. Yet, this is exactly what Toth did in an interview with Yahoo News when he said, quote, "This bill is a direct reflection of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It echoes Dr. King's wish that we should judge people on the content of their character, not their skin." End of quote. The content of the character of white supremacy is in direct opposition to Dr. King's vision of a just society. To equate Toth's promotion of white supremacy laws as being equivalent to Dr. King's promotion of civil rights is clearly a false equivalency. Finally, when schools prohibited from requiring teachers to teach their students that slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from true American values like liberty and equality, the prohibition is based on a false dichotomy. Slavery and racism are not equal to deviations from American values, but are themselves the core values from which the society was constructed as a race-based society. When one race has the legitimate power to create a racial classification and enslave and oppress others and other races on the basis of that classification, that is called racism, because the ism is the doctrine that justifies the mistreatment based on race, so that the values of liberty and equality are only meant to apply to the superior race at the expense of the other races. This is why it was possible for white people to own black people by the authority of a doctrine that labeled the blacks 3/5 of a person. Therefore, it is a false dichotomy to equate slavery and racism with deviations from American values. Slavery and racism are indeed the core of the racial construct itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. Very well said. Dr. Ron Glass, what you have to say from your lofty perspective? Ron? Ron? Earth to Ron. Come in, Ron. Okay, he might have had to go.
He had to leave.
Okay, he did have some faculty duties. So, Kelly, are you still there? And she also had some duties. So, Dr. Ken Tankersley.
I love this addressing false equivalencies. And I think the one that strikes me, to the heart of the conversation is that the GOP's proposal for restricting voter rights is to ensure that we have a honest vote. When in reality, that what we should be doing is to ensure that all Americans can exercise the right to easily vote with undue hardship. And that is absolutely crucial. Our nation's democracy is at stake here, not only in the voting booth, but also in our educational systems, as Dr. Washington pointed out. For myself as an educator and for everyone else out there who is an educator, this threatens our freedom of speech and freedom to educate within the classroom. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. And let me just say, to kind of like wrap it up and come in for a landing, the last several speakers have been involved with education, both Ken and Mike and Ron earlier. Now, it seems like to me that there needs to be some organizing amongst educators around the point that you, Ken, just raised. That is to say that this is cutting off your own academic freedom and your own free speech, right of free speech, to say that you can't even deal with the truth of the things that you have researched, and also that you have been qualified and certified as a PhD to talk about. I mean, that's absurd to say that you can't even talk about the history of how things develop the way that they are. So it seems like educators need to get educated on this and begin to organize from within the various fiefdoms that we call universities and colleges, and demand that that where it is appropriate to demand so, that these things not be tolerated by the schools at any level, particularly at the level of higher education. People in public education are less powerful, but there's teachers' unions. Teachers' unions ought to stand against this. This would be something that they could organize around. Teachers' unions could. Now, when I first began this talk, I couched my comments in legal challenges and legal issues. Well, we've got law school students all over this country who need practice filing preemptory briefs. There needs to be some preemptory briefs that are designed as class action suits that stop in each state where this is happening, stop this or preempt it and call for these things to be challenged on the basis of it denying due process rights. It's denying equal protection of the laws according to Article 5 of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment. It's a violation of the voting rights protections of 1870 with the 15th Amendment, as well as the voting and civil rights and protection provisions that are in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. If there are some law professors that are listening to this, this would be some great homework that you could get your students to do. I learned from David Billings that the challenges that eventually became successful challenges in the form of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision of Topeka, Kansas of 1954, that Thurgood Marshall was one of a generation of law school students who cut their chops on creating briefs and challenges and doing the legwork that would challenge the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. It took from 1896 to 1954 to be able to get Supreme Court enough to where this was challenged successfully at that level. Nothing less than that kind of effort must be done. So people who are getting their law degrees from historically black universities and colleges, they need to step up to the plate and begin to study these things because they have a vested self-interest in doing so and organizing around that. I mentioned also that we have not only civil rights, but we have human rights. Then those who are inclined to do so and protect our human rights need to begin to create shadow reports to monitor these civil rights and human rights violations, which are in the form of these voter suppression laws, and contact the various treaty bodies of the United Nations, that is the ICCPR, Human Rights Council and Committee, as well as the CERD Council and Committee, and a request and demand for the UN to monitor the upcoming elections the same way that they would do in any despotic banana republic where they have suspicions. And my last point is that right now, President Joe Biden is meeting with members of the G7 in Europe, and they all have come to consensus around trying to punish China around China's human rights violations. Well, they need to punish themselves. That is, Joe Biden and his administration needs to punish themselves for the violations that they are allowing to go on under their watch, while they say that as Democrats they're friends of black people, but they can be no friends of black people if they're not challenging these laws in a preemptive way. It does me no good if you cry over my body after I've been hit by a car when you had the power to change the laws and the traffic violations that create these types of things. I'm thinking, Reggie, of what the Black Panthers had to do in order to get people to slow down on Market Street. They had to march across the street with guns and escort people across Market Street in Oakland because so many black people were being killed on that street when you were growing up as a child. And it took that in order to create now a situation where there's a traffic light and a speed limit that people obey without the Black Panthers stepping out in the street with a gun in their hand. I'm not expecting or calling for the Democrats to do that, but they need to do something just short of that in order to prove that they deserve the votes that black people waste on them every election cycle, and then we get nothing on our return. We don't get, if you were to do a cost-benefit analysis, we're not getting our money's worth out of our vote as black people, voting for the Democrats all the time, who know that we have no place to go politically but them. That's the false dichotomy that we have been put in this society, that we have to depend on either Republicans or the Democrats as our saviors, when really, as Dr. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick said, they're both wings of the same buzzard, and they just feed off the carrion of the black community in terms of the death toll in different ways. They have different diets, but they still are eating that same carrion meat, because they depend on our misery to stay in power. And I'm saying, as a person of African descent, that if you say that you recognize us as human beings, show that. First of all, you need to show that by challenging the fact that our voting rights have to be reviewed every 25 years. What the hell is up with that? As the Reverend Buford cussing now, but what the hell is up with that? You know, that our rights have to be challenged and curtailed and edited every 25 years. Who has the brains and the backbone to stand up in Congress and say, wait a minute, this is bullshit? You know, we're not, you know, they're not doing that for any other people, but yet we accept that every